sun was setting as I left the city behind, heading for a weekend getaway at my cabin in the woods. It had been a hectic week, and I was looking forward to some peace and solitude. The drive was long but straightforward, until I took a wrong turn onto a deserted country road. The GPS signal had dropped, and the map app on my phone was no help. With no real choice, I decided to continue down the winding road, hoping it would eventually lead me back to a more familiar route. The further I drove, the more the landscape seemed to darken and close in around me. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands in the fading light. Just as I was beginning to doubt my decision, I saw a figure standing by the roadside. He was a young man, looking disheveled and desperate, waving frantically for a ride. His clothes were torn, and there was a wild, frantic look in his eyes. I hesitated, but the thought of getting help for my navigation problems, or perhaps a little company, made me pull over. He approached my car with an urgent look on his face, and as I rolled down the window, he started speaking rapidly. "Thank God. I didn't think anyone would come by. I've been out here for hours. Can you give me a lift?" Something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. He seemed genuinely frightened, but there was also a hint of something unsettling in his eyes. Despite my reservations, I decided to let him in. He slid into the passenger seat, and I started driving again. The atmosphere in the car was tense. The man was jittery, constantly glancing around as if expecting someone to appear. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension, but he barely responded, his focus seeming to drift in and out. He kept staring out the window, his eyes wide and filled with a kind of raw fear I couldn't quite place. We drove in silence for a while, and I could feel the weight of the strange situation pressing down on me. My unease grew with every mile. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the darkness outside deepened. The man's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would mutter to himself, and his hands fidgeted nervously. At one point, he turned to me suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They're following us." I glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing but darkness. "Who's following us?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. He shook his head vigorously, his eyes darting around. "I don't know. I can't see them, but I know they're back there. They've been chasing me for days." My heart raced at his words. I tried to rationalize the situation, but his fear was palpable. "It's probably just your nerves," I said, attempting to reassure him. "There's nothing out there." He didn't seem convinced. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling. "They're not normal. They can't be." I could feel my anxiety mounting as I continued driving. The road ahead was completely dark, with only the dim glow of the headlights piercing through the gloom. The man's paranoia was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm. "Stop the car," he shouted. "They're getting closer." I slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. I glanced around, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The darkness outside was impenetrable, and I saw nothing that would indicate we were being followed. The man's panic escalated. "They're out there. I know it. We have to hide." Before I could react, he threw open the door and leaped out of the car. I was stunned, unsure of what to do. I could hear him running through the underbrush, his cries fading into the distance. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. I glanced around, but the darkness was all-encompassing. There was no sign of anyone or anything. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. Reluctantly, I got out of the car, calling out for the man. "Hey, are you okay?" There was no response. I walked a few steps into the woods, but the darkness swallowed me up. I called out again, but there was still no answer. My unease turned to fear as I realized how isolated I was. I returned to the car, my mind racing. I couldn't just leave him out there, but I also didn't want to get lost in the woods myself. I got back in and started the engine, trying to think of what to do next. As I drove slowly, scanning the area for any sign of the man, I noticed a flickering light in the distance. My heart leapt with hope. Maybe it was a house or some kind of shelter. I followed the light, which seemed to be moving as if someone was carrying it. I approached cautiously and saw the source of the light, a small makeshift lantern hanging from a tree. Next to it was a crude, hand-drawn sign that read, "Help me." My blood ran cold as I realized the lantern and sign were hastily placed, almost as if someone had set a trap. I got out of the car and approached the lantern. The area around it was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I looked around, trying to find any sign of the man or other people, but the woods were silent and still. The lantern's light cast long, flickering shadows, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I glanced at the sign again, and it seemed to be moving slightly, as if trying to point me in a specific direction. My fear was mounting, and I decided I needed to get out of there. I got back into the car, locked the doors, and started to drive away. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I could almost sense something following me. As I sped down the road, my headlights picked up a shadowy figure in the distance. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it was definitely moving. I accelerated, my fear propelling me forward. The figure seemed to fade into the darkness as I drove faster. The road seemed endless, and my anxiety reached a fever pitch. The darkness outside felt oppressive, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone closing in on me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the lights of a small town in the distance. I pulled into a gas station, my hands trembling and my heart pounding. The attendant looked at me with concern as I stumbled inside, my face pale and my clothes disheveled. I explained what had happened, but the attendant seemed skeptical. He called the police, who promised to send someone to check out the area. They arrived a short while later and took my statement, but they didn't find any sign of the man or anything unusual. They assured me it was probably just a case of someone who was lost or distressed. I spent the night at the gas station, trying to calm down and make sense of what had happened. The police report was inconclusive, and the man remained missing. I tried to put the experience behind me, but the fear and unease lingered. Even now, whenever I'm driving alone at night or in unfamiliar places, I can't shake the feeling that something is lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The memory of the desperate hitchhiker, the flickering lantern, and the shadowy figure remains a haunting reminder of how quickly a seemingly ordinary situation can turn into a nightmare. I was on the road again, driving through the vast emptiness that stretched for miles. There's something both liberating and unnerving about long road trips, especially when the road seems to stretch into infinity and the only company is the humming of the engine. This time, I was heading to visit an old friend in a small town about 300 miles away. I decided to take a lesser-known route, one of those back highways that barely show up on the map, cutting through barren landscapes with nothing but the occasional truck stop or lonely gas station. It was one of those roads where you can drive for hours without seeing another car. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I had about 150 miles to go when I first noticed the black SUV. It wasn't close at first, just a speck in the rearview mirror, but something about it caught my attention. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen another car for over an hour, or maybe it was the way it seemed to match my speed, staying at the same distance behind me. First, I brushed it off, I'd been driving for hours and figured I was just getting tired, maybe a bit paranoid. After all, it's easy to start imagining things when the scenery is nothing but the same stretch of desert and scrubland. I turned up the radio, trying to distract myself and focus on the road ahead. But the SUV didn't go away. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, it was still there. Close enough to make me feel uneasy, but far enough that I couldn't make out the driver. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just someone else taking the same route. I wasn't used to these lonely stretches of road, so it was probably normal to feel on edge. Still, the tension started to build. The sky was darkening, the sun sinking lower, and the SUV seemed to loom larger in the mirror. I checked the clock. 2 more hours to go. I could make it, I told myself. Just focus on getting there and stop being paranoid. About an hour into the drive, the SUV was still there. It had been trailing me for over an hour at this point, matching my speed exactly. No matter how fast or slow I went, it stayed at the same distance. The highway was empty. No exits, no signs of civilization. The only sounds were the low rumble of my car and the whispering wind outside. I decided to test it. I eased off the gas, slowing down gradually to see if the SUV would pass. Instead, it slowed down too, mirroring my speed. A cold chill ran through me. I tapped the brake a little, but the SUV stayed right where it was, just far enough back to be a shadowy shape, its headlights dull in the fading light. My heart began to race. This wasn't just a coincidence. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe the driver was lost, or maybe they were scared to be out here alone too. Perhaps they were just keeping pace to feel safer. But something about the situation felt deeply wrong, instinctively, unmistakably wrong. Suddenly, the SUV's headlights flashed, bright beams cutting into my rearview mirror. I squinted, momentarily blinded. Then the lights went off, plunging the road behind me into darkness. A minute passed. The headlights came back on, shining directly at me again. Then off. On. Off. On. Each flash was deliberate, rhythmic, almost taunting. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just some nervous driver. It felt like they were playing a game and I was the target. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road ahead and think of my options. Should I pull over? Let them pass? But something deep inside told me that was exactly what they wanted. I didn't dare stop. I pressed the gas pedal harder, speeding up. But the SUV stayed right with me, its lights flashing intermittently, each time feeling more like a threat. The sun had fully set now, the sky a deep, starless black. The desert around me seemed to close in, the road narrowing in my mind. I was alone, completely isolated. My phone had no signal, and there were no towns, no gas stations, nothing but miles of darkness. Just me and the SUV. Suddenly, I saw a sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead. Relief washed over me. I could pull in there, maybe get out and find someone, anyone, or at least wait it out in a more populated place. I sped up, keeping my eyes on the sign as it grew closer. As I approached the rest stop, I signaled, preparing to pull off. But the SUV flashed its lights again, and then it sped up. For the first time, it closed the distance between us, pulling up right behind me, tailgating aggressively. My heart pounded in my chest. They didn't want me to stop, they wanted me to keep driving. Fear flooded through me. I ignored the exit and kept going. The SUV stayed right on my tail, so close now that I could see the outline of the driver. Just a shadow behind the wheel, no features visible in the glare of the headlights. The road stretched on, and so did the chase. The SUV would fall back, then surge forward, its headlights blinding me every few minutes. I was stuck, miles away from any help, being hunted by someone I couldn't even see. Another sign appeared, gas station 10 miles ahead. I had to make it, My mind raced with what I would do once I got there. Run inside, lock the doors, ask for help, call the police, anything to get away from this person. I pressed the pedal to the floor, praying the car would hold up. As the gas station came into view, a small, dimly lit building on the side of the road, I made a split-second decision. I wasn't going to stop. I would slow down just enough to make it look like I might, but then keep going, hoping the SUV would pull in and leave me alone. My hands were slick with sweat, my throat dry, as I neared the station. I slowed down, pretending to veer toward the lot, and then at the last second, I hit the gas again. The SUV didn't fall for it. It stayed right on me, swerving violently, as if it knew exactly what I was trying to do. Then the worst thing happened. The gas station passed, and my fuel light blinked on. I hadn't filled up in hours, and now I was running on fumes. Panic surged through me. If I ran out of gas out here with that thing behind me, I didn't know what would happen, but I knew it wouldn't be good. I tried to calculate how much farther I could go, scanning the horizon for any sign of help. But it was useless. The highway stretched on into the blackness, and I was completely alone. The SUV flashed its lights again, this time longer, almost blinding me. I could feel it. Whoever was driving was getting ready to do something, but I didn't know what. That's when the SUV sped up, pulling alongside me, matching my speed. My heart was in my throat. I glanced over, but the windows were tinted too dark to see the driver clearly. Just a shadow, a silhouette in the night. They stayed beside me for a few terrifying moments, as if sizing me up, deciding what to do next. And then, suddenly, they swerved, their car jerking violently toward mine, almost pushing me off the road. I barely had time to react, swerving away to avoid a crash. My tires screeched, and the car fishtailed, but I managed to keep control. The SUV backed off for a moment, only to surge forward again, this time forcing me even closer to the edge of the road. I was screaming now, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands, my entire body shaking with fear. The SUV was relentless, forcing me off the pavement, closer to the dirt shoulder. I had no choice. I slammed on the brakes, my car screeching to a halt. The SUV sped past me, its taillights disappearing into the night. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe they'd finally gotten bored, finally left me alone. But then, in the distance, I saw the red glow of their brake lights. They were stopping. My heart stopped. I knew deep down they weren't done. They were coming back. Without thinking, I jammed my foot on the gas, my car lurching forward, tires kicking up dust as I shot back onto the road. I was running on fumes now, the gas gauge buried on empty. But I didn't care. I had to get away. In my rearview mirror, I saw the SUV turn around, its headlights bright and cold, bearing down on me again. I floored it, my car roaring as it ate up the miles. The SUV was gaining. But then, suddenly, the road curved, and I saw something that gave me a flicker of hope. Another car up ahead, its taillights bright in the distance. I sped toward it, praying it was real, praying I wasn't hallucinating. The SUV was closing in. I could see it in my rearview mirror, see the glint of its headlights, the shadowy figure behind the wheel. But then I reached the other car. I flashed my brights, honked my horn, anything to get their attention. They must have seen me because they sped up too. The SUV slowed down, falling back. And then, just like that, it turned off onto a side road and disappeared into the night. I didn't stop driving until I reached my friend's house hours later, shaking and exhausted. I never saw the black SUV again, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever was behind the wheel is still out there somewhere, waiting for their next victim. The drive home from my business trip should have been a straightforward affair, but something about it was off from the start. It began with a sudden, inexplicable detour. My GPS had gone haywire, rerouting me through an unfamiliar stretch of highway. I had no choice but to follow the directions, hoping to get back on track soon. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. The new route took me through a remote area, with dense trees closing in on either side. It felt strangely isolated, the kind of place that seemed almost untouched by civilization. The loneliness of the road made me uneasy, but I pushed through, determined to make it home before nightfall. An hour into the drive, the sky was nearly dark, and I noticed a small, dimly lit gas station up ahead. The place was old and run down, but it was the only sign of civilization for miles. I pulled in, eager for a break and a chance to stretch my legs. The gas station had an air of desolation. The pumps were dusty, and the convenience store looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The only light came from a flickering neon sign that advertised cold drinks and snacks. I parked my car and walked inside. The store's interior was cluttered and grimy, with a faint smell of mildew in the air. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He greeted me with a nod but didn't say much. I grabbed a few snacks and a bottle of water, then went to pay. As I was checking out, I noticed a beat-up old sedan parked at the edge of the lot. It looked like it had been abandoned. The driver's side door was slightly ajar, and the seat was empty. There was something unsettling about the car, but I tried to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. "Everything all right?" I asked the cashier, trying to make conversation. He gave me a distracted nod, not looking up from the register. "Just the usual," he mumbled. I paid for my items and walked back to my car. I took one last look at the old sedan and saw that its driver's side door was now closed. I shook my head, attributing the change to my tired eyes. The night had fully descended, and the darkness outside was almost palpable. I got into my car, started the engine, and began to drive away. The road was winding and isolated, with only the occasional flash of my headlights cutting through the blackness. As I drove, I felt a growing sense of unease. The trees seemed to press in closer, and the road stretched out endlessly before me. My headlights picked up a figure standing by the roadside, dressed in ragged clothes. I barely had time to register what I'd seen before I had to swerve to avoid hitting them. My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the figure had vanished. I shook off the incident as a trick of the light or my exhaustion playing tricks on me. I pressed on, determined to get home as quickly as possible. The road seemed to go on forever, and the darkness made it hard to gauge my surroundings. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange. The sound of my car's engine seemed to be accompanied by a faint rhythmic thumping. I tried to ignore it, but the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing mile. I pulled over to check the tires and undercarriage but found nothing amiss. As I resumed driving, I noticed the thumping sound had stopped. I let out a sigh of relief, but the sense of unease remained. I continued down the road, my eyes darting around nervously. Suddenly, I saw something moving in the passenger seat. My heart skipped a beat as I realized there was someone sitting next to me. The figure was shrouded in darkness, and I could only make out the vague outline of a person. Panic surged through me, and I glanced over, but the seat was empty. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was racing. How had someone gotten into my car without me noticing? My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel sweat forming on my brow. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. A few minutes later, I felt a cold breath on the side of my neck. I nearly jumped out of my seat, glancing quickly to the side. The passenger seat was still empty, but the feeling of someone, or something. Breathing down my neck was unmistakable. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling. I quickly checked the back seat and the area around me, but there was no sign of anyone. I even checked the trunk, convinced that someone might have been hiding there, but everything was as it should be. I was alone. I got back in the car, trying to calm my racing heart. I resumed driving, my nerves on edge. The road was still isolated, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on me from all sides. I could hear the thumping noise again, but it was more insistent this time, like a heartbeat echoing through the car. Desperation took over, and I drove faster, hoping to reach some sign of civilization. But the road continued to stretch on, the trees closing in tighter with each passing mile. I felt a creeping sense of claustrophobia, like the darkness was closing in on me. The thumping sound grew louder, and I could feel a presence beside me, even though I couldn't see anything. I glanced over at the passenger seat again and saw a shadowy figure sitting there, its face obscured. I slammed on the brakes, sending the car skidding to a stop on the deserted road. I turned to face the figure, but it was gone. The seat was empty, and the car was eerily silent. I felt a wave of nausea and fear wash over me. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps, and I could feel my hands shaking. I knew I had to get out of there. I threw the car into reverse, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. I backed up quickly, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and then I slammed the car into drive, speeding away from the place that had become a nightmarish trap. The road seemed endless, and my anxiety was reaching a fever pitch. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was lurking just out of sight. I drove for what felt like hours, my eyes straining to see through the darkness. Eventually, I saw the lights of a small town in the distance. Relief surged through me as I approached the familiar sight of streetlights and buildings breaking the oppressive darkness. I pulled into a gas station and stumbled inside, my heart still racing. The attendant looked at me with concern as I recounted the terrifying experience. I must have looked like a wreck. My clothes were disheveled, and my face was pale. The attendant listened with a skeptical expression but offered me a cup of coffee and a place to sit. I drank the coffee, trying to steady my nerves, and waited for the police to arrive. They took my statement and promised to send someone to check out the area where I'd been. They seemed doubtful about my story, but they assured me they would investigate. The rest of the night was a blur of exhaustion and fear. I tried to sleep but kept hearing the thumping sound and feeling the presence beside me. The memory of the shadowy figure and the cold breath on my neck haunted me. When the police returned, they reported finding nothing unusual. The area was quiet and deserted, and there was no sign of anyone or anything that could explain what had happened. They assured me it was probably just a result of my fatigue and stress, but I knew what I had experienced was real. I finally made it home, but the terror of that night stayed with me. The road, the gas station, the shadowy figure. Each detail was etched into my mind, a chilling reminder of how quickly a routine drive can turn into a nightmare. Even now, when I'm on the road or alone in the dark, I can't shake the feeling that something is lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. I was already on edge by the time I saw him. The sun had long since disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the sky a deep, oppressive black with only the stars and the pale moon offering any light. The stretch of road I was driving on was one of those desolate desert highways, miles from any town, and I'd been on it for hours. The occasional rock formation would loom out of the darkness, but mostly it was just endless, flat desert. Nothing to break the monotony but the dull hum of my engine. It was late, Too late to be out here, but I was trying to make it to a small town a couple 100 miles away. I didn't want to stop and sleep in my car. Not out here. I had no cell service, no radio signal, and nothing but a gnawing sense of isolation. The desert at night is a strange thing, beautiful in its stillness, but it wears on you. The vastness, the nothingness. It starts to mess with your head. The silence becomes too loud, and every shadow looks like something more than it is. I was lost in those thoughts when I saw him. At first, he was just a vague shape on the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. A man standing still, his thumb out in that universal gesture. He looked rough, like he'd been out there for a while. Dusty clothes, matted hair. But his face was what made me slow down. It wasn't desperation I saw. It was fear. I don't know what came over me. I never pick up hitchhikers, not after the stories I'd heard. But something about the way he stood there, eyes wide, trembling slightly, made me feel like I had to help. It was late. The road was empty, and this guy looked like he needed it. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, making me want some human contact. But against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man approached my car slowly, as if he wasn't sure I was real. Up close, I could see he was young, probably around my age, mid-30s, but he looked exhausted, his face lined with dirt and grime. His clothes were ragged, like he'd been walking for days. I rolled down the window just enough to talk. "You need a ride?" I asked, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. "Please," he said, his voice shaky. "I've been out here for hours. No one stopped." Something about his voice tugged at me. It wasn't just fear. It was the kind of fear you don't just get from being stranded. I hesitated for a moment, but then unlocked the passenger door. He didn't say thank you, didn't smile. He just climbed in and sank into the seat, staring straight ahead. I pulled back onto the road, and for a few minutes we drove in silence. I glanced over at him now and then, but he just stared out the windshield, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. His clothes smelled like sweat and dirt, and there was an odd tension in the air that made my skin prickle. Finally, I broke the silence. "Where are you headed?" He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the road ahead. Then, in a low, almost mechanical voice, he said, "How far are you going?" "About 100 miles to the next town," I replied. "If you need to go farther than that, there might be a bus station there." He nodded but didn't say anything. I noticed his leg was shaking, his knee bouncing up and down like he was nervous. Something about it made me uneasy, but I didn't want to press him. I figured maybe he'd had a rough day. Maybe something bad had happened out here in the middle of nowhere. Who knows how long he'd been walking? We drove on, the silence growing more uncomfortable with each passing mile. I tried to think of something to say, but the words caught in my throat. His presence was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on me, but I couldn't put my finger on why. Then, out of nowhere, he broke the silence. "Do you ever think about what it'd be like to disappear out here?" I nearly jumped. His voice was calm, almost too calm, but the question sent a cold chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't look at me, didn't move, just kept staring ahead. "A lot of people go missing out here. You know that, right? The desert, it swallows them up. Sometimes they're never found." My throat tightened, and I felt my grip on the steering wheel falter for a moment. I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced. Was he trying to scare me? Was he one of those weird types who like to spout off creepy facts to make people uncomfortable? "I've heard stories," I mumbled, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was tight, like he was forcing it. "You should know the stories. People think the desert is just empty land. But it's not. It's alive. Takes things." His voice had changed too, colder now, more detached. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to pull over, to kick him out, to get away. But I couldn't. Something in his tone froze me to the spot, locked me in place. We drove in silence again for what felt like forever. The road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, the desert a dark, yawning abyss on either side. I could feel his eyes on me now, though he wasn't moving. It was like he was waiting for something. I cleared my throat, trying to break the tension. "So, what happened to you? How'd you end up out here?" He turned to me then, his eyes gleaming in the faint light from the dashboard. His face was blank, emotionless. "My car broke down," he said flatly. "Where?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was thudding in my chest. "Back there." He gestured vaguely behind us. I didn't remember seeing a broken-down car. But then again, the desert swallows everything. "How long were you out there?" I asked, my voice still casual, but my nerves were starting to tighten. He didn't answer, just kept looking at me, his expression unreadable. That's when I noticed it, the smell. At first, I thought it was just the staleness of his clothes, the dirt and sweat from being out in the desert for so long. But then it hit me, strong and unmistakable, the smell of rot, decay. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I glanced over at him again, really looking at him this time. His skin was pale, almost gray in the dim light, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His hands, clenched in his lap, looked wrong. The skin around his knuckles was cracked, raw, like he'd been scratching at something for too long. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road. I didn't want to look at him anymore. We were nearing a small truck stop now, a lone beacon of light in the darkness. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do. I couldn't keep driving with him. Something was wrong with him, and I needed to get away. I decided I would stop at the truck stop, tell him I needed gas, and then leave him there. Maybe he'd go inside and get some food or something, and I could just drive off. As we pulled into the parking lot, I noticed it was nearly deserted. There were a few big rigs parked on the far side, their engines rumbling softly in the night, but no other cars. I pulled up to the gas pump and turned to him. "I'm just going to fill up," I said, forcing a smile. "You can go inside if you want. Get something to eat." He didn't move, didn't even blink, just kept staring at me with those empty eyes. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "You don't want anything?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "No," he said softly. "I'll wait." I nodded, swallowing hard, and got out of the car. My legs felt shaky as I walked toward the pump, glancing around nervously. The truck stop was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the big rigs and the faint buzz of the neon lights. I started pumping gas, my eyes flicking toward the car every few seconds. He hadn't moved, just sat there, staring straight ahead. My heart was racing, and all I could think about was getting out of there. I would fill the tank just enough to get to the next town and leave him behind. But as the gas flowed, I realized something was wrong. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out, no service. Great, I thought, just perfect. I looked back at the car, and for a moment, I thought I saw him turn his head, his eyes following me as I stood there. But when I blinked, he was still staring ahead, as if he hadn't moved at all. I finished pumping, got back in the car, and started the engine. The tension was unbearable now, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I wanted to say something to break it, but I couldn't find the words. We pulled back onto the highway, the truck stopped disappearing behind us, swallowed by the darkness. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "You should have left me there," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "What?" I said. He repeated, his voice chilling. "You should have left me there." I looked over at him, and this time his face had changed. There was something twisted about his expression, something not quite human. His eyes were wide, wild, and his lips curled into a smile that didn't reach them. I slammed on the brakes, pulling the car to the side of the road, my hands trembling. "Get out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move. I said, "Get out," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. He slowly turned to face me, his smile growing wider. And in that moment, I knew he had never needed a ride. He had never been stranded. I had picked up something else entirely. Without another word, he opened the door, stepped out, and walked into the darkness, vanishing into the desert without looking back. I didn't wait. I floored the car, roaring back onto the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I never saw him again, but I can still smell that rotting scent in my car. I can still hear his voice echoing in my mind. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there on the side of the road, waiting for another ride, waiting for someone else to make the mistake I did. The drive home from work was always a blur of stoplights and pavement, a mindless routine that rarely changed. But on this particular Friday, the unexpected happened. I found myself taking a detour through the countryside, drawn by a sudden need to escape the monotony. My GPS was acting up, showing me a route I'd never taken before, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I decided to follow it. The sun had begun to set, casting long, dark shadows over the road as I ventured deeper into the forest. Trees lined the narrow road, their branches clawing at the edges of my windshield. The deepening twilight made the landscape look almost unreal, like a scene from a nightmare. My phone signal had dropped to 0 bars, and the only company I had was the rhythmic hum of the engine. After what felt like hours, I saw a sign up ahead, "Rest stop, 1 mile." I hadn't realized how fatigued I was until I saw that sign. A break sounded perfect, just a quick stop to stretch my legs and grab a snack before continuing on my way. I hadn't passed another vehicle for miles, and the isolation was beginning to weigh on me. The rest stop appeared as a small, dimly lit area surrounded by dense trees. The building was old, its paint peeling and windows grimy. The neon sign above the entrance flickered sporadically, casting an unsettling light. There was a single picnic table outside, and the parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles. I parked my car and stepped out, stretching my stiff muscles. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and decay. As I approached the entrance, I noticed a lone figure sitting at the picnic table. He was hunched over, seemingly absorbed in something, and he wore a ragged coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His presence was oddly incongruous with the otherwise deserted rest stop. I hesitated for a moment, but my fatigue overrode my sense of caution. I walked into the rest stop, greeted by a musty odor and the dim, flickering light inside. The cashier, a middle-aged man with an unshaved face and tired eyes, glanced up from behind the counter but said nothing. I picked out a few snacks and headed toward the register. The cashier rang me up in silence, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds, as if he were expecting someone. I glanced out the window while paying, and the figure at the picnic table was still there, his posture unmoving. The air inside the rest stop felt oppressive, like it was holding its breath. "Everything okay?" I asked the cashier, trying to make small talk and break the silence. The cashier nodded curtly. "Yeah, just the usual night," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I finished paying and stepped back outside. My curiosity about the stranger got the better of me, and I walked over to the picnic table, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. The man didn't look up as I approached. "Hi," I said tentatively. "Are you okay?" He looked up slowly, his eyes dark and hollow. His face was gaunt, and his skin was sallow and blotchy. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with an unsettling, vacant expression. Then he spoke, his voice a raspy whisper. "Don't go down that road," he said, his eyes darting nervously to the dense woods surrounding the rest stop. "It's not safe." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The man's gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not just the road. It's the woods. They don't like strangers." I looked back at the trees, their dark silhouettes casting long, eerie shadows. "What happens if you go down there?" I asked, trying to understand. The man's face twitched with fear, and he leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You don't come back. No one does. They take you." His words hung in the air like a bad omen. I was about to respond when a sudden noise startled me. A loud clattering sound from behind the rest stop. My heart raced, and I glanced over, but the night was too dark to see anything clearly. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man's expression turned even more frantic. "They're here," he said, standing up abruptly. "You need to leave now." I took a step back, feeling a surge of panic. I turned to head back to my car, but the man grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Please," he pleaded, "don't go down there. They're coming." I tried to pull away, but his hold was firm. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. The cashier appeared at the door of the rest stop, watching us with a mixture of concern and fear. "Let him go," the cashier said, his voice strained. "Just leave. It's not worth it." I yanked my arm free and hurried back to my car, my pulse pounding in my ears as I fumbled with my keys. I glanced back at the rest stop. The man was now standing near the edge of the woods, staring intently into the darkness as if waiting for something to emerge. I got into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the gloom, casting a weak light on the surrounding trees. I drove slowly, my anxiety making every shadow seem menacing. The figure at the picnic table had disappeared, and the woods seemed even darker now, more oppressive. As I drove down the road, my mind was consumed with thoughts of what the man had said. The trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching out like grasping fingers. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The road was narrow and winding, and the deeper I went, the more isolated it felt. The darkness was nearly complete, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of leaves. I could feel my heart racing, and every little noise made me jump. I saw something ahead, a faint light flickering in the distance. My hope soared as I approached, thinking it might be another rest stop or a cabin. But as I got closer, I realized it was just a small makeshift lantern hanging from a tree, its light casting eerie shadows on the road. I slowed down, scanning the area for any signs of life. The lantern was the only thing that broke the darkness, and it only served to make the shadows around it more pronounced. I drove past it, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the woods around me felt alive, like they were closing in. My nerves were frayed, and I felt like I was on the edge of a breakdown. Every shadow, every rustle, seemed to be hiding something sinister. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the glow of headlights. Relief washed over me as I realized I was approaching another gas station, this one bright and well lit. I pulled in, my hands trembling as I parked the car. The gas station attendant looked at me with concern as I stepped inside. I must have looked a mess. My clothes were disheveled, and my face was pale. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words came out in a jumble. The attendant listened with a skeptical look but offered me a cup of coffee and a place to sit. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. The coffee helped, and I managed to collect myself enough to call the police. They took my statement and promised to send someone to check out the rest stop in the woods, but they seemed doubtful about my story. They assured me that it was probably just a misunderstanding, but their dismissive attitude did little to ease my fears. As I sat in the gas station, waiting for the police to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The memory of the man at the rest stop, his fearful warnings, and the strange noises in the woods lingered in my mind. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. When the police finally returned, they reported finding nothing unusual. The rest stop was empty, and the woods were quiet. They didn't find any trace of the man or anything that might explain what had happened. I tried to make sense of it, but the events of the night left me shaken. I was exhausted both physically and mentally, and all I wanted was to get out of there. I paid for the coffee and left, my nerves still on edge. The drive home was a blur of fatigue and anxiety. The woods, the rest stop, the strange warnings, they all felt like a haunting dream. I was relieved when I finally pulled into my driveway, but the unease lingered. Even now, months later, the memory of that night still haunts me. The woods remain an impenetrable darkness in my mind, and the rest stop is a place I would never willingly visit again. The man's warnings, the eerie lantern, and the oppressive silence of the forest serve as a chilling reminder of how quickly something ordinary can turn into a nightmare. I've always liked driving at night. There's something about the open road, the dark sky above, and the hum of the engine that feels peaceful. So, when my boss asked me to drive out of state for a late-night meeting and return the same night, I didn't think twice. The idea of a solo road trip, even with the long hours, was almost appealing. It was an easy enough route, mostly highway cutting through miles of farmland and forest. I'd driven through that part of the state before, so I figured it would be a quiet, uneventful trip. By the time the meeting ended, it was well past 10 p.m., and I still had a 4-hour drive ahead of me. I grabbed a coffee to stay awake, climbed back into my car, and hit the road. Everything was fine for the first hour, just the familiar blur of dark trees and the distant glow of passing towns. But as I drove deeper into the countryside, the roads became more isolated, and the night seemed darker, heavier, like the sky was pressing down on the world. It was around midnight when I started feeling the fatigue setting in. My eyes were getting heavy, and despite the coffee, I knew I couldn't push through much longer without a quick rest. That's when I saw the sign. Rest stop, 2 miles. Perfect, I thought. I'll pull in, take a break, stretch my legs, and then finish the rest of the drive. When I finally saw the rest stop appear on the horizon, it wasn't exactly inviting. It was one of those small, run-down places, just a couple of parking spaces, a dilapidated bathroom, and a single flickering light illuminating the area. No other cars were there, which didn't surprise me given how late it was. Still, I felt a slight pang of unease as I pulled into the lot. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing, where even the wind seems to hold its breath. I parked under the light, figuring it was safer than parking in the shadows. The building was old, the paint peeling off the walls, and the windows were caked in dirt. But all I needed was a quick nap, just 20 minutes to recharge. I leaned my seat back, closed my eyes, and let the quiet wash over me. For a few minutes, everything was fine. I was on the edge of sleep, drifting in and out, when I heard it. A sharp metallic tap against the car window. My eyes snapped open, and my heart jumped into my throat. I shot upright, gripping the steering wheel instinctively. For a moment, everything was silent again, and I wondered if I'd imagined it. Just a trick of my tired mind. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate tap, like someone was gently tapping a metal object against the glass. I turned my head toward the passenger side window, and my breath caught in my chest. There was a man standing there, right next to my car, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the flickering light. He was tall, wearing a filthy jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. In his hand, he held something small and shiny, tapping it against the window. His head tilted slightly, like he was curious, like he was waiting for me to notice him. I froze, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had I not heard him approach? Where had he come from? The parking lot had been completely empty when I arrived, and I hadn't seen or heard another car pull in. The man smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down my spine. His teeth were yellowed and crooked, his lips cracked and dry. He tapped the window again, this time a little harder. "Hey," he said, his voice muffled through the glass. "You need some help?" I shook my head, trying to stay calm. "No, I'm fine. Just resting." His smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider. "You sure about that? You look tired." His voice was too friendly, too casual, like we were old acquaintances. But there was something off about it, an edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm fine," I repeated, my voice firmer now. I didn't want to engage with him any more than necessary. I just wanted him to go away. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring at me through the window, still smiling that unsettling smile. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rest stop was so quiet that the sound of my own heartbeat felt deafening in my ears. Then he leaned in closer to the window, so close that I could see the grime on his face, the stubble on his chin, and the way his eyes gleamed in the faint light. "Mind if I sit with you for a bit? Keep you company?" I felt a surge of panic rise in my chest. This wasn't normal. No one asks to sit in a stranger's car in the middle of the night. Not like this. Something was wrong. "I'm good," I said quickly, my hand inching toward the door lock. "I'm about to leave anyway." The man didn't move. He just kept staring at me, that smile never leaving his face. The rest stop was so quiet that my breath felt louder than it should have. My mind raced as I kept my hand near the lock. The man's unsettling gaze didn't waver, and his smile seemed to grow colder. "No need to be in such a hurry," he said, his voice too calm, too deliberate. "You look like you could use some rest. It's dangerous to drive when you're this tired." I pressed the lock button, and the sound echoed through the car. His smile faltered for a split second, his eyes narrowing, but then he chuckled. The sound was low and raspy, like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "No need to do that," he said softly, his tone almost mocking. "I'm just being friendly." I didn't respond. My mind raced with possible actions. Start the car? Drive off? But what if he had a weapon? What if he tried to stop me? The man seemed to sense my fear because his expression shifted. His smile faded completely, replaced by something darker, more calculating. He stepped back, his eyes still locked on mine. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, "a lot of people come through this rest stop. Most of them don't even realize how easy it is to disappear out here." My blood ran cold. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, my pulse thundering in my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He shrugged, his gaze never leaving mine. "I'm just saying, it's a long road, not many people around. You never know who you'll run into." He took another step back, his smile returning. but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Anyway," he said, almost casually, "you have a safe trip now. Maybe I'll see you around." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the flickering light. I sat frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, watching the spot where he'd vanished. The night seemed heavier now, the silence pressing against the windows of my car. Only when I was absolutely sure he was gone did I dare to move. I started the car, the sound of the engine breaking the oppressive quiet, and pulled out of the parking lot. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped onto the highway, my hands trembling on the wheel. For the next hour, I drove as fast as I could, not caring about the speed limit, not caring about anything except putting as much distance as possible between me and that rest stop. When I finally reached the next town, I was physically and emotionally drained. My nerves were frayed, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying the encounter. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station, parked the car, and just sat there, trying to catch my breath. The gas station was busy, with people coming and going, a stark contrast to the eerie isolation of the rest stop. I felt safer here, surrounded by others. After a few moments, I decided to stretch my legs and grab another coffee. Inside the station, the normal hustle and bustle felt almost surreal. But no matter how many people were around, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man again, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. But he wasn't there. No one was. I grabbed my coffee and headed back to the car, convincing myself that I was overreacting. It was late. I was tired. Maybe I'd let my imagination run wild. Sure, the man had been creepy, but perhaps he was just lonely, someone looking for a bit of conversation. Maybe I'd misinterpreted his intentions. As I unlocked the car and climbed back inside, I let out a small sigh of relief. Everything would be fine, I told myself. I just needed to get back on the road, finish the drive, and forget about the whole thing. But when I reached for the coffee cup I'd set down on the passenger seat, I froze. There, lying on the seat, was a small, shiny object. The same one the man had been tapping on my window. It was a coin. The coin was old, tarnished, and scratched, as though it had been handled countless times. Its surface glinted faintly under the overhead light of the gas station. But what drew my attention most was the symbol etched into its center. It wasn't anything I recognized. A jagged circular pattern that seemed to twist in on itself, like some kind of abstract maze or vortex. My fingers brushed against its cold surface as I picked it up, and an involuntary shiver ran down my spine. I turned the coin over in my hand, trying to make sense of how it had ended up in my car. Had I missed him slipping it in? Was it there the whole time, and I hadn't noticed? The thought that he had been close enough to leave it behind, that he might have reached into the car at some point, made my stomach churn. As I stared at the coin, an overwhelming sense of unease settled over me. It didn't feel like a simple token or random object. It felt deliberate. A message. I shoved the coin into my pocket and glanced around the gas station parking lot, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings. The place was brightly lit, with cars pulling in and out and people coming and going. But that didn't comfort me. Not entirely. Every shadow seemed darker now, every movement sharper. My mind was racing with paranoia, imagining the man from the rest stop lurking just beyond the lights, watching me. I shook off the thought and climbed back into the car, locking the doors behind me. As I pulled out of the gas station and back onto the highway, I couldn't help but glance at the passenger seat, half expecting the coin to reappear. Didn't, but that didn't make me feel any better. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and dark, the occasional streetlight casting fleeting pools of light. The night seemed quieter than before, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for any sound, no matter how small. My thoughts were scattered, alternating between replaying the encounter at the rest stop and trying to make sense of the coin. Why had he left it? What did it mean? And then, there was the other question, the one I didn't want to think about. Had I escaped him? It was just past 3 a.m. when I finally saw the faint glow of my city's lights on the horizon. Relief flooded through me, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to relax slightly. The familiar streets were a welcome sight as I navigated my way home. When I finally pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I let out a long, shaky breath. I sat there for a moment, the car silent around me, before finally stepping out and locking the doors. Inside, my house was quiet and comforting. I tossed my keys on the counter, slipped the coin out of my pocket, and set it down on the table. Under the bright light of the kitchen, the symbol on the coin seemed even stranger, more intricate. I snapped a quick photo of it with my phone, intending to research it later, and placed the coin in a drawer. I didn't want to look at it anymore. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the encounter with the man, the tapping on the glass, his crooked smile, his cryptic words about people disappearing. And the coin. The symbol seemed to dance behind my closed eyelids, twisting and shifting like it was alive. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragmented and unsettling. Dark woods, flickering lights, and the man's face. His grin stretching wider and wider until it wasn't a face at all, just a shadow with gleaming teeth. I woke up in a cold sweat just before dawn, my heart racing and my hands clammy. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to distract myself with work, errands, anything to take my mind off the previous night. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. That night, when I went to retrieve something from the kitchen, I noticed the drawer where I'd placed the coin was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I opened the drawer, my hands trembling, and stared down at the empty space where the coin should have been. It was gone. Sure, here's the continuation of the story in English. As I drove further into the night, my grip on the steering wheel tightened. The highway stretched endlessly before me, flanked by the shadows of dense trees and the occasional outline of a broken fence. Despite the coffee, my exhaustion was catching up, but the unease from the rest stop encounter kept me sharp. Every now and then, I'd glance at the coin resting on the passenger seat, its strange symbol catching the faint glow of the dashboard lights. It felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of something unseen, something malevolent. I told myself to forget about it, to move on, but the echo of the man's words kept replaying in my mind. It's easy to disappear out here. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I found myself checking my rearview mirror more often than necessary. The highway was eerily empty. No headlights in the distance, no taillights ahead. Just me and the darkness. I turned on the radio, desperate for some distraction, but the static-filled hum only heightened my anxiety. Every channel seemed dead. Then the lights on my dashboard flickered. No, I muttered, hitting the dashboard with the heel of my hand. The engine sputtered for a brief second before steadying. I exhaled deeply, but the relief was short-lived. A faint noise, like the low hum of an engine, began to grow louder behind me. My eyes shot to the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights had appeared out of nowhere, far in the distance. They were moving fast, faster than seemed safe on this winding road. At first, I thought it might be a passing trucker, but as the lights drew closer, I noticed something odd. The vehicle, whatever it was, didn't seem to bounce or shift the way normal cars do on uneven terrain. It glided unnaturally, as if hovering just above the ground. I tapped the gas, speeding up slightly. My heart raced as the headlights grew closer. They weren't swerving to pass. Instead, they locked onto me, staying perfectly aligned with my car. I tightened my grip on the wheel, adrenaline overtaking exhaustion. My mind raced through possibilities. Was it him? The man from the rest stop? Or someone worse? I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as the car surged forward, but the headlights didn't falter. If anything, they grew brighter, closer. The road ahead twisted sharply, and I took the turn at a reckless speed, my tires screeching against the asphalt. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them. The headlights disappeared around the curve, and the oppressive silence of the night returned. But then the coin began to vibrate. At first, I thought it was the tremble of the engine, but as I reached over to pick it up, I realized it was vibrating on its own, pulsating like a living thing. I slammed it down on the seat, my heart pounding. The headlights reappeared, brighter than ever, flooding my mirrors with blinding light. I couldn't take it anymore. I yanked the wheel to the right, pulling off the road and into a narrow gravel path that cut through the woods. The car jolted violently over the uneven terrain, branches scraping against the windows like claws. I killed the engine, plunging myself into darkness, hoping to hide. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for the vehicle to pass. But the sound of its engine never came. The woods were deathly silent, save for the faint creak of the car settling into the dirt. And then I heard it, the tap. A single, deliberate tap against the driver's side window. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath caught in my throat. Outside the window, illuminated faintly by the moonlight, was the man from the rest stop. His face was twisted into that same unsettling smile, his yellowed teeth glinting in the faint light. He raised his hand and tapped the window again, holding up another coin identical to the one on my seat. I screamed. My hand shot to the ignition, twisting the key with shaking fingers. The engine sputtered once, twice, but didn't start. Outside, the man's smile widened, his eyes glinting with malice. He mouthed something I couldn't hear, but the gesture was unmistakable. It's too late. The woods around me seemed to come alive. Shadows moved in unnatural ways, slithering and creeping closer to the car. The air grew thick, suffocating, as the tapping on the window turned into a frantic pounding. Not just from him, but from every side. Something was surrounding the car, unseen figures pressing against the glass, their distorted faces peering in. I screamed again, my hands trembling as I tried the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse, the tires kicking up dirt as I shot backward onto the main road. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the guttural, inhuman screams echoing through the trees. I drove for what felt like hours, my knuckles white on the wheel. When I finally reached the safety of a brightly lit gas station, I stumbled out of the car, shaking uncontrollably. The coin fell from my pocket, landing with a hollow clang on the asphalt. I stared at it, unsure if I should pick it up or leave it behind. The gas station clerk approached, concern etched on his face. "You all right, buddy?" he asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Instead, I picked up the coin, staring at the strange symbol etched into its surface. I didn't know what it meant or why it had chosen me, but one thing was certain: I would never drive alone at night again. I had just started my new job in a city a few hundred miles away and had to make a quick trip back home to pick up some personal items. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive. Nothing special, just a round trip to grab some belongings and head back. I left early in the morning to avoid the heavy traffic and make good time. The drive itself was uneventful until I hit a stretch of road that seemed to stretch endlessly through the forest. The trees were dense and close to the road, casting deep shadows even in the daylight. I could tell this was the kind of place where the darkness would swallow everything up once the sun set. I wasn't worried though. I had driven this route before and knew it well. Around mid-afternoon, I arrived at my old house, packed up what I needed and said my goodbyes. The drive back was more challenging. Fatigue was setting in, and I had been on the road for hours. To keep myself alert, I decided to take a break at a small rural gas station I'd passed earlier. It wasn't much, just a few pumps, an old convenience store, and a rickety-looking picnic area. But it was better than nothing. The sun was setting as I pulled in, casting long shadows over the area. The gas station was nearly deserted, with only one old pickup truck parked at the far pump. I decided to stretch my legs, grab a drink, and then get back on the road. As I walked into the convenience store, the old man behind the counter gave me a nod but didn't say anything. The store was dusty and smelled of old cigarettes and stale coffee. I grabbed a soda and some snacks, paid quickly, and headed back to my car. That's when I noticed something strange. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. At first, I thought I might have left it open, but the lock was definitely in place. I was certain I had locked it. I approached the car, and as I got closer, I saw something odd. A faint mark on the driver's seat, like someone had been sitting there recently. My stomach churned with unease. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a figment of my tired imagination, but the feeling of dread was creeping in. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. I was ready to leave, to put the unsettling encounter behind me. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. The old pickup truck was now parked directly behind me, blocking the exit. My heart started to race. I had seen the truck there when I arrived, but now it was much closer, and the driver's side door was wide open. The truck was old and beat up, its paint chipped and rusted. The driver's seat was empty, but the truck's engine was running, and the headlights were glaring, casting an eerie light over the scene. I stopped the car, trying to get a better look. The old man from the store had come outside and was standing by the door, watching me with an unsettling gaze. I could feel his eyes on me, and the weight of his stare made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that I was imagining things, but the sense of foreboding was growing stronger. I needed to get out of there. I was tired, on edge, and the last thing I wanted was to get stuck in a situation where I felt unsafe. I tried to pull forward, but the truck remained firmly in my way, the driver's side door still open and the engine idling. I honked the horn, hoping to get the old man's attention, but he didn't move. He just kept staring at me, and that's when I saw it. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a shadow moving in the truck. A figure, hunched over, seemed to be reaching for something. My blood ran cold. In a panic, I shifted the car into reverse and backed up quickly, barely avoiding the old pickup truck. I sped out of the parking lot, the truck following closely behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The headlights of the truck were right on my tail, and I could see the faint outline of the old man in the driver's seat. I tried to stay calm, but the road was winding and unfamiliar. I knew I had to get away, but every turn seemed to take me deeper into the woods. The truck was relentless, its headlights piercing through the darkness. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the old man's face was there, watching me with those hollow, unblinking eyes. I kept driving, my mind racing, trying to think of a way to escape. I spotted a narrow dirt road leading off the main highway and decided to take it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The truck followed, and the narrow road was barely wide enough for my car, let alone two vehicles. I drove faster, my tires kicking up dust and gravel, and the truck stayed right on my tail. I could hear its engine roaring behind me, a constant reminder of the danger I was in. The trees closed in around us, and the darkness grew thicker, swallowing the road ahead. At one point, I had to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting a fallen branch. The truck didn't stop. I heard a sickening thud as it crashed into the back of my car, and I lost control for a moment. The car skidded off the road, coming to a jarring halt against a tree. I was disoriented, my head spinning from the impact, I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, and saw the old pickup truck stopped a few yards away. The engine was still running, and the old man was getting out of the truck, moving toward me with a slow, deliberate gaze. I fumbled with the door handle, trying to get out of the car, but it was jammed. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped. The old man was getting closer, and I could see the glint of a metal object in his hand. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I scrambled to the back seat, trying to find something I could use to defend myself. I managed to grab a tire iron I kept for emergencies and readied myself as the old man approached the car. His face was expressionless, his eyes cold and distant. I heard the sound of the car door being yanked open, and the old man reached in, his hand grasping for me. I swung the tire iron wildly, striking him in the arm. He recoiled, but he didn't back away. Instead, he pulled out a knife, the blade glinting menacingly in the dim light. The struggle was chaotic, and my fear made everything feel like it was in slow motion. I swung the tire iron again, this time catching him in the chest. He stumbled backward, but his eyes never left me. There was something terrifyingly calm about his demeanor, like he was almost enjoying this. I managed to force the car door open and stumbled out. The old man was still advancing. I ran into the woods, the underbrush scratching at my legs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear him calling after me, his voice echoing through the trees. Desperation gave me strength, and I ran as fast as I could, pushing through the branches and the dark. The forest seemed endless, and the darkness was closing in around me. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever, but I had to try. I had to survive. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small cabin, barely visible through the trees. I didn't know if it was occupied or if it was safe, but it was my only hope. I pounded on the door, my hand shaking uncontrollably. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard. He looked at me, confused and alarmed, but I pleaded with him to let me in, explaining what was happening. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled me inside and locked the door behind me. We listened as the old man's footsteps grew faint, eventually fading into the distance. I was safe for now, but the terror of the night lingered, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. The man who had helped me was kind enough to let me use his phone to call the police. They arrived shortly after, but by then, the old man had vanished. They searched the area but found no trace of him or his truck. I was taken to a nearby hospital to be checked out, but aside from a few bruises and scratches, I was fine. The whole experience left me shaken, and I couldn't stop thinking about the old man's hollow eyes and that metal object he carried. I never learned who he was or what his intentions were, but the memory of that night haunts me. The rest stop, the old truck, the struggle in the woods, each detail is etched into my mind. A chilling reminder of how quickly a routine trip can turn into a nightmare. Even now, when I drive through the woods or see a dilapidated gas station, I feel a shiver run down my spine. The forest is no longer a tranquil place. It's a reminder of the darkness that can lurk just beyond the edge of the road, waiting for the right moment to strike.